long-form commentary by Professor Nam-Yong Lee, Rethinking the December 3rd Emergency Martial Law. Hello, this is Nam-Yong Lee on Lee Nam-Yong Professor TV. On the night of December 3rd last year, the term emergency martial law reappeared in our constitutional history. A mode of emergency rule that had effectively been sealed away since 1979 was once again taken out and used in 21st century Korea. Barely 6 hours later, martial law disappeared with the National Assembly's resolution to lift it, and the sequence of events continued on to the presidential impeachment vote and the decision of the Constitutional Court. In this commentary, I will not ask who won or which political camp was right. Instead, I would like to look back through the lens of relational philosophy on that night and its aftermath and examine painfully how unprepared the President, Cabinet Ministers and members of the National Assembly were and how far short they fell of the people's expectations in terms of professional competence and patriotism. Martial law is not the President's political card, but the people's very lives. First, we must be clear about the nature of martial law itself. Martial law is not a last political card to be played when a president is cornered politically. The moment martial law is proclaimed, the basic rights guaranteed to the people by the Constitution are broadly restricted. The military, in effect, takes over policing, censorship, and parts of the judicial function, and the media, public assemblies, and political activity come under the shadow of military orders. This is not a mere legal measure. It is a systemic shock that shakes the whole of daily life and the right to life of the people. International human rights norms and the emergency governance principles of advanced democracies insist that such measures must have a clear basis in law, be genuinely necessary in light of a concrete emergency, be proportionate to the level of danger, and be strictly temporary. In short, martial law should not be a shield used to secure a regime's survival. It should be a tragic option that may or may not be used even once, and only at the very end in order to protect the state and the people as a whole. Yet, the emergency martial law of December 3rd did not arise in the context of war, nationwide armed rebellion, or foreign invasion, but against a backdrop of political deadlock, legislative conflict, and impeachment battles. At this point, we cannot help recalling how lightly the President and those around him must have regarded the weight of martial law, and how superficially they must have understood the constitutional and international standards governing it. In that very moment, martial law ceased to be a matter of the people's lives and was degraded into a political card calculated according to the gains and losses of those in power. The President's flawed assessment of crisis and the absence of professionalism and patriotism. From the standpoint of relational philosophy, the President is not merely an individual. He is the central node of a vast national web of relationships. When that node decides what qualifies as a crisis, the lives of millions of people, the markets, diplomacy, and security all tremble at once. A genuine crisis leader must possess a high level of professional competence that enables him to read not only physical threats such as war, but also exchange rates, sovereign credit ratings, foreign investment flows, international media coverage, and the gaze of allied nations. Moreover, the orientation of that expertise must consistently be aligned with a patriotism that prioritizes the constitutional order and the interests of the people as a whole over the maintenance of any particular administration. Looking back at the proclamation of martial law on the night of December 3, it is difficult to say that the President met both of these standards at the level the people are entitled to expect. It is hard to find any trace of a sober comparative analysis answering questions such as, in which advanced democracy is martial law declared on the grounds of conflict with the legislature, budgetary disputes, or impeachment strife? How even the attempt to do so shakes exchange rates, government bond yields, and foreign investor sentiment, and how allies and the international community look upon a state that takes such steps. In the end, the proclamation of martial law reveals either a fundamental lack of expertise in constitutional law, security, and international politics as they relate to emergency rule, or even if such expertise existed, that its patriotic orientation had tilted toward defense of the regime, relegating the constitutional order and the national economy to secondary concerns. For the people, either of these possibilities is a bitter reality. Why did cabinet ministers not once declare that they would stand beside the Constitution? The people who must check and correct the President's decisions at his side are the cabinet ministers. The Constitution assigns to each minister not only the duty to carry out administrative functions, but also the duty to uphold the Constitution and a corresponding political responsibility. The cabinet meeting is not a ceremonial occasion where one listens to a presidential speech and applauds. It should be a gathering of experts who relentlessly ask questions such as, is this assessment of crisis grounded in fact? Does this measure meet the legal requirements for martial law? Is it not an excessive restriction on fundamental rights? What repercussions will it have in the international community and the markets? However, when the cabinet deliberated the emergency martial law of December 3rd, there was in fact no minister who vehemently opposed the necessity or legal basis of the proclamation, or who pointed to its possible unconstitutionality and walked out of the meeting. This is a deeply saddening reality for all of us. Not one person could say publicly, Mr. President, this is not a path that a free democratic republic can choose. In relational philosophical terms, the relationship between the President and the Cabinet had regressed from a horizontal partnership, standing together on the ground of the Constitution and checking one another, to a vertical relationship of obedience centered on personal position and deference to the President's mood. The moment ministers chose silence out of fear for their positions instead of standing beside the Constitution and the people, that silence became in itself both a failure of professional competence and a failure of patriotism. True patriotism is not expressed in salutes to the flag. It is revealed in the courage to say, no, Mr. President, when that is what the country and the Constitution require. SHSH, Shivtishal Havike, MSH, Ter, SHSH, Shift LHPVKH, AVTV, Havida, BK Shivat, Shevri, Vibli Bil, Kavil TB. This emergency martial law came to an end roughly 6 hours after it was proclaimed, through the National Assembly's resolution to lift it and the President's acceptance. This 6-hour martial law is something rarely seen in world history. This strange timetable tells us two things at once. First, up to the moment of proclamation, there had been almost no serious strategic discussion or shared understanding among the presidential office, the cabinet, the ruling party leadership, and the military command as to the meaning and implications of martial law, or the scenarios for maintaining, easing, or terminating it. Second, when the public, the National Assembly, the markets, and the international community reacted with shock and opposition, there was neither the professional capacity to bear responsibility for the proclamation to the end, nor the confidence to struggle to explain and persuade the people. In the language of relational philosophy, this is both a failure of communication and a confession of collective incompetence. A truly prepared leadership would have had multiple scenarios in place before pressing the martial law button. For example, for how long and in what phases will this be sustained? How will the National Assembly and the courts respond? How will foreign media and financial markets move? Under what conditions and by what procedures will martial law be lifted? Such detailed assumptions and testing should have preceded any decision. Yet the 6-hour proclamation and 6-hour reversal leave a strong impression that the people were thrust wholesale onto a martial law testbed without such preparation. This was not a simple miscalculation. It was a self-exposure of a serious lack of expertise in crisis management and emergency governance, and a scene that reveals how complacently patriotism toward the people and the constitutional system was exercised. The National Assembly's impeachment and the Constitutional Court's ruling, formal procedures are not enough. After the martial law episode, the National Assembly passed an impeachment bill against the President, and the Constitutional Court upheld it, removing the President from office. On the surface, it appears that the legislature checked executive power, the judiciary guarded the Constitution, and the constitutional order restored itself. Yet from the people's perspective, a sense of frustration remains. In the process of passing the impeachment motion, to what extent did the National Assembly systematically examine the facts and law surrounding martial law, as well as international comparisons and precedents from advanced democracies? Did it go beyond party lines and factional interests to genuinely study and debate the Constitution and the institution of emergency rule itself? This is a question the Assembly must ask of itself. The Constitutional Court, too, must look back and ask whether, in recognizing a serious violation of the Constitution and law, it explained its criteria and reasoning to a degree that the public could fully understand. Formal votes and judgments alone did not make the boundary between political and legal responsibility, or between judging a particular administration and defending the constitutional system, clearly visible in the minds of the people. The result is a dangerous split in public perception, in which one side believes it was a just impeachment, while the other sees it as political retribution. This also means that the National Assembly and the Constitutional Court went through the motions of procedure without fully carrying out explanation and persuasion, the final task of democracy. A legislature and judiciary possessing genuine professional competence should leave their decisions behind as records that future generations can consult and scrutinize, built on the utmost transparency and rigorous argumentation. In that sense, I feel a deep regret that the professionalism and patriotism of our lawmakers and those charged with constitutional adjudication did not fully meet the expectations of the public. The lesson of relational philosophy and FEA: without professionalism and patriotism, the system will collapse again. Relational philosophy sees the world not as objects but as relationships. The proclamation of martial law on December 3rd, the 6-hour period during which it was in effect, and the subsequent impeachment and removal from office cannot be explained solely as the error of a single president. They represent a failure of the entire web of relationships linking the president, cabinet ministers, ruling and opposition party leaders, the military command, the media and new media, and civil society. From the perspective of FEA, the Federal Enterprise Architecture, our emergency governance system still lacks properly designed core functions for defining crises, making decisions, and exercising oversight and control. There is no agreed standard or model, backed by data, for determining what rises to the level of a crisis warranting consideration of martial law. It is difficult to verify after the fact who examined which alternatives on what grounds before choosing martial law. The systems by which the Cabinet, National Assembly, Constitutional Court, audit institutions and civil society might detect and warn of signs of abuse of emergency powers in advance have not operated adequately. Within this structure, power elites who lack professionalism and patriotism easily fall into an evil cycle. Legal review becomes a formality, emergency powers are brandished without hesitation, and responsibility is continually shifted from one actor to another. To break this cycle, we must spell out in greater detail, in statute, the conditions and limits for declaring martial law, and explicitly ban its use as a tool for resolving political disputes. We must provide regular education in the Constitution, martial law, and emergency governance for cabinet ministers, military leaders, and senior officials, so as to cultivate the competence and courage to refuse or resign in the face of wrongful emergency orders. In addition, regardless of which administration is in power, both conservatives and progressives must reach a bipartisan agreement on at least one basic constitutional principle: we will not mobilize the military to fight the opposition. That is what it means to replant professionalism and patriotism across the entire relational network. Now we must stand not beside a person, but beside the Constitution. On the first anniversary of the December 3rd emergency martial law, the questions we must ask are not who was more at fault or which camp won. Did the President, at the moment he proclaimed martial law, truly take into sufficient account the Constitution, the international order, and the national economy? Did the cabinet ministers, instead of clinging to their posts, ever resolve to risk their positions or even their lives to defend the Constitution? Before voting on impeachment, did members of the National Assembly read the materials, consult experts, and study examples from around the world? Faced with these questions, I find it hard, in all honesty, to answer in the affirmative. During the night of December 3rd, the 6 hours that followed, and the time of impeachment, the image presented by Korea's governing elite resembled less constitutional guardians endowed with professionalism and patriotism, and more a rather small-minded group that lacked study, resolve, and conscience in the face of crisis. Yet I still believe in the wisdom and conscience of our people. Even now, rather than asking whose fan we will be or which camp we will support, we must ask what principles and which constitution we will stand beside. When the next crisis arrives and future generations look back on us, I hope they will be able to say, at that time, our parents' generation firmly rejected the temptation of emergency martial law and stood beside the Constitution. To make that possible, we must, from this very moment, study, question, and scrutinize the President's decisions, the silence of cabinet ministers, the votes of the National Assembly, and the rulings of the Constitutional Court will not escape the cool judgment of history and the people. Ensuring that this judgment becomes even a little more just and mature by honestly repairing our institutions and our web of relationships. That is the sole purpose for which I offer this commentary today. Thank you for watching this long-form commentary by Professor Nam-Yong Lee.